From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We must stand our ground to ensure that our laws reduce violence and take a hard look at laws that contribute to more violence than they prevent.
Attorney General Eric Holder says it's time to push back against stand your ground laws nationwide and calls for the Department of Justice to file civil rights charges against George Zimmerman for the killing of unarmed teen Trayvon Martin. We'll speak with Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow.
The appearance of racial equality, the superficial appearance of racial equality that Barack Obama's election has afforded, serves to mask a deeply disturbing underlying racial reality, which is that large segments, a majority of African-American men in some urban areas are either under the control of the criminal justice system or branded felons for life, locked in a permanent second-class status.
And what happened to Trayvon Martin and the lack of punishment faced by his killer is not unique. We'll look at a report by the Malcolm X grassroots movement that found at least 136 unarmed African Americans were killed by police and security guards over the course of 2012. But first, we go to California, where prisoners have entered the 10th day of a hunger strike, calling for better conditions, many of them held in solitary confinement for over a decade.
As of today, July 16, 2013, 2,493 inmates in 15 state prisons are participating in a mass hunger strike. 201 inmates in 7 state prisons refuse to go to work today.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Protests are continuing nationwide in the aftermath of the weekend acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin. Hundreds of people marched in Los Angeles and San Francisco Tuesday night for the 4th straight day. In Washington, D.C., the Reverend Al Sharpton gathered with other civil rights leaders outside the Justice Department to call for rallies in 100 cities this weekend demanding justice for Trayvon.
Let us be clear. It is now because of these laws and upheld by a jury in this trial where anyone walking, committing no crime, can be followed or approached by another civilian, and they can use deadly force and say it was self-defense. That is something that is frightening and cannot be allowed to sustain itself in our society.
Meanwhile, in Florida, protesters have begun a sit-in at the office of Republican Governor Rick Scott in Tallahassee. Organizers with the group Dream Defenders want Scott to call a special legislative session to repeal Florida's Stand Your Ground law. They vowed to remain until their concerns are addressed. Demonstrators also rallied Tuesday at the Florida Department of Justice field office in Gainesville. Speaking Tuesday at the NAACP's annual convention in Orlando, Attorney General Eric Holder said it's time to push back against stand your ground laws nationwide.
By allowing and perhaps encouraging violent situations to escalate in public, such laws undermine public safety. The list of resulting tragedies is long and unfortunately has victimized too many who are innocent. It is our collective obligation. We must stand our ground to ensure that our laws reduce violence and take a hard look at laws that contribute to more violence than they prevent.
The music legend Stevie Wonder has announced he's boycotting Florida and all other states with stand your ground laws in the aftermath of George Zimmerman's acquittal. During a performance in Canada, Stevie Wonder said he would no longer perform in Florida until stand your ground is repealed.
I decided today that until the stand your ground law is abolished in Florida, I will never perform there again. As a matter of fact, wherever I find that law exists, I will not perform in that state or in that part of the world.
The lone juror from George Zimmerman's trial to publicly speak out since his acquittal continues to stoke controversy. On Tuesday, juror B37, as she's known, told CNN's Anderson Cooper she thinks Trayvon Martin's killing was justified.
in your heart and in your head, you are 100% convinced that George Zimmerman, in taking out his gun and pulling the trigger, did nothing wrong?
I'm 101% that he should have done what he did, except for the things that he did before.
You mean he shouldn't have gotten out of the car, he shouldn't have pursued Trayvon Martin, but in the final analysis, in the final struggle,
when the end came to the end,
he was justified.
He was justified in shooting Trayvon Martin.
In a statement, 4 other jurors of the 6-woman jury from the trial sought to distance themselves from the comments, saying the opinions of juror B37 were her own. We'll have more on the aftermath of the George Zimmerman verdict later in the broadcast. The National Security Agency whistleblower Edward Snowdens formally applied for temporary asylum in Russia. Snowden's been stranded in Russia, unable to travel to Latin America, where 3 countries have offered him refuge. On Tuesday, a Russian lawyer who helped prepare Snowden's application said he fears returning to the U.S. could subject him to torture or even the death penalty.
He is being persecuted by the United States of America, or rather by the U.S. government. That's what he wrote. I'm quoting him. He fears for his life, for his safety. He fears that torture or the death penalty can be used against him.
By seeking temporary asylum rather than political asylum, Snowden technically won't need the personal approval of Russian President Vladimir Putin in order to stay. Putin says Snowden can remain so long as he stops leaking U.S. secrets. In Washington, D.C., White House Press Secretary Jay Carney renewed the administration's demand for Snowden's extradition. Carney said Snowden is neither an activist or a dissident.
Our position is that Mr. Snowden ought to be expelled and returned to the United States, and that he should not be allowed to engage in further international travel except as necessary to return to the United States. You know, he is not a human rights activist. He is not a dissident. He's accused of leaking classified information. He's been charged with 3 felony counts related to the leaking of classified information. And for those reasons, he should be returned to the United States.
The secret court overseeing government surveillance has ordered the Obama administration to release the 2008 decision authorizing the Internet spying program Prism. The web giant Yahoo had asked the FISA court for permission to disclose Prism after Edward Snowden revealed its existence last month. Snowden's alleged that Prism taps directly into the servers of the nation's Internet giants to collect millions of communications in the U.S. and abroad. The White House has until late next month to decide which parts of the decision will be published. A coalition of 19 groups has filed a lawsuit challenging the NSA's wholesale collection of phone records. Brought by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the suit accuses the NSA of violating the group's right of association through the collection of metadata on all U.S. calls. It's the first legal action to directly target the NSA since its massive surveillance operations were revealed. Republicans have dropped their blockade of a number of President Obama's appointees in return for preservation of the Senate filibuster. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid had threatened the so-called nuclear option of using Democrats' Senate advantage to push through new rules ending Republicans' ability to stall presidential picks and leave top positions unfilled. After Republicans backed down Tuesday, the Senate immediately voted to confirm Richard Cordray as the first permanent director of the Consumer Financial Protection Board. The deal also means confirmation votes for 6 other nominees, including Thomas Perez for Labor Secretary and Gina McCarthy to head the Environmental Protection Agency. In return, Democrats agreed to replace 2 Obama picks for the National Labor Relations Board appointed during the Senate recess. The new picks are Nancy Schiffer, an attorney with the AFL-CIO, and Kent Hirasawa, the chief counsel to the current NLRB chair, Mark Pierce. The United Nations continues to warn the conflict in Syria is fueling the worst refugee crisis since the Rwanda genocide. On Tuesday, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, said most of Syria's 1.8 million refugees have fled since the beginning of the year.
There are now nearly 1.8 million Syrian refugees known to UNHCR in the region. 2/3 of them have fled Syria since the beginning of this year, an average of over 6,000 people a day. We have not seen a refugee outflow escalate at such a frightening rate since the Rwandan genocide almost 20 years ago. This crisis has been going on for much longer than anyone had feared, with unbearable humanitarian consequences.
The official UN death toll for Syria's more than two-year conflict is near 93,000. Egypt's interim government sworn in its first cabinet since the ouster of President Mohamed Morsi earlier this month. The army general who led Morsi's removal, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, stays on as defense minister. The cabinet also includes 3 women. No positions are held by members of the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamist parties. The Muslim Brotherhood says it doesn't recognize the new government, calling it illegitimate. In North Carolina, more than 100 people, most of them women, were arrested during the 11th weekly Moral Monday protest at the state legislature. This week's action focused on attempts by the Republican-controlled legislature to curb abortion rights and the not guilty verdict in the George Zimmerman trial. The protest came just days after the North Carolina House approved sweeping anti-choice restrictions latched onto a motorcycle safety bill. The state Senate is expected to pass the bill, and North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory has said he will sign it, despite his campaign promise not to approve new abortion restrictions. More than 800 people have been arrested in the weeks of protests organized by the NAACP against the Republican agenda in North Carolina, including cuts to social programs, restrictions on voting rights, and the rejection of Medicaid expansion under President Obama's health care law. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around